The untold story of Judas before he betrayed Jesus. The coins were already in his hand before the sun rose over Jerusalem. 30 of them. Cold. The familiar weight of something that could not be undone. And somewhere across the city, in a garden he had walked through 100 times, the man who had chosen him was already on his knees. This is not the story of a monster. Monsters do not weep in potter's fields. Monsters do not throw silver at the feet of priests and walk away with nothing. Monsters do not exist in the pages of the Gospels. Only men do. Men with convictions, men with wounds, men who believed so completely in something that when it became something else, they had no language left for what remained. His name was Judas, and before he was the betrayer, he was the one who was trusted. The town of Keriyyot sat in the southern hill country of Judea, far from the fishing villages and the northern wind of Galilee. It was a modest settlement, dry stone walls, terraced fields, the kind of place that produces men who are careful with money because money was never abundant. Men from Keriyyot kept accounts. They remembered what things cost. His full name in the Hebrew tradition would have been Judah bar Simon. Judah, son of Simon. Judah, the same name as the patriarch whose tribe had produced David, whose line would produce the Messiah. It was a name that carried the full weight of national identity and prophetic expectation. And the word Iscariotes, the designation that would follow him through every gospel account and into every century after, remains even now a word scholars argue over. The most common reading, Iscariot, Man of Keriyyot, the only disciple definitively from Judea in a group of 12 men who were otherwise all Galileans. Think about what that meant in practice. These were men who shared dialect, landscape, memory. They had grown up within a day's walk of each other. They laughed at the same references. They knew each other's families. And then there was Judas, educated, precise. From the south, who had walked north to follow a rabbi from Nazareth and found himself surrounded by fishermen who sometimes looked at him the way people look at someone who arrived at the wrong party but was too polite to leave. The second reading of Iscariots is darker. Some scholars, particularly those who study the Aramaic roots of the name, connect it to Sicarius, the Latin word for dagger man. The Sicarii were a radical faction of Jewish insurgents who assassinated Roman collaborators in broad daylight and vanished into crowds. If this reading is correct, Judas did not merely come from a different region. He came from a different ideology, one that had very specific expectations about what a Messiah would do when he arrived. What we know with certainty from the Gospel of John is this: Judas carried the bag. He was the treasurer of the movement. In a group of 12 men who had left their livelihoods to follow an itinerant teacher, someone had to manage the donations, the food costs, the lodging arrangements. That someone was Judas. You do not give the money to the man you don't trust. You give it to the man who is organized, reliable, and clear-eyed about practical matters. He had been chosen, deliberately, by name. But there were signs, small ones, the kind that only become visible in retrospect. The first, in the early months of the ministry, Judas asked questions that the other disciples didn't ask. Not questions of faith, questions of logistics. Where are we going next? How long will we stay? What is the plan after the Passover? The others walked in the immediate present of the kingdom. Judas was always thinking one move ahead, the second. When the crowds grew and the miracles multiplied, something in Judas's face would shift, not joy, calculation, as though he was watching a force accumulate and wondering when it would be deployed. The third, he was never recorded laughing. In a text full of meals and weddings and children and celebrations, Judas appears in the shadows of accounts, near the money, near the door, holding something. But do not mistake caution for absence of faith. Do not read the ending back into the beginning, because before any of it unraveled, Judas of Keriyyot was a man who had left everything to follow Jesus, and that was not a small thing. There was a morning, early in the Galilean ministry, when Jesus sent the 12 out 2 by 2 with authority to heal the sick and cast out unclean spirits. Judas went. He preached. He laid hands on the suffering and watched something beyond his own power work through him. He came back with the others, breathless and changed, and sat with them while they compared what they had seen. The lame who walked, the fevered who cooled, the bound who were loosed. That morning was real. Whatever happened later, that morning was real. The Gospel of Luke records that all 12 were sent. All 12 returned with joy. Lord, even the demons submit to us in your name. Judas said those words too, or words like them. He had felt the authority move through his hands. He had seen faces change. He had been part of something he could not explain and could not deny. This matters. It matters because what broke in Judas was not cynicism that was always there. What broke was belief, and belief must exist before it can be broken. For 3 years, he walked the roads of Galilee and Judea and the regions beyond the Jordan. He was present at the feeding of the 5,000, present when 12 baskets of fragments were gathered and he had to count them, hold them, carry them. He was there when Jesus walked on the water and Peter sank and was lifted. He was there at the Transfiguration. Oh no, the Gospels do not record him there. Only Peter, James, and John were taken up the mountain. And perhaps that is where the fracture began to open, because the 12 were not treated as 12 equals. There was an inner circle, Peter, James, John, who were taken aside for the private moments, the mountain moments, the moments of unveiled glory. Judas was always in the larger group, always trusted with the money, never taken up the mountain. He had organized the food for the 5,000. He had managed the travel funds through Samaria and Perea and back. He had made the practical arrangements for the Last Supper itself. Jesus had sent 2 disciples ahead to find the room, but someone had to pay for it. Someone had to confirm the arrangements. That was Judas's work, always the infrastructure of the miracle, never the inner chamber of the mystery. And he believed. For 2 years, perhaps 2.5, he believed. The sermons on the kingdom were not metaphors to him. The crowds that pressed against Jesus were not simply an audience to be managed. Judas of Keriyyot had grown up in a land occupied by Rome, taxed by Rome, humiliated by Rome. And here was a man who could feed thousands with nothing, who could silence storms, who spoke of a kingdom coming with an authority that made the religious establishment physically afraid. He had a vision of what that kingdom would look like. He had built it carefully, detail by detail, over 3 years of watching power accumulate. And the vision was specific. The vision had Rome defeated and the temple restored, and Israel sovereign, and 12 men seated on 12 thrones. The number was in the promise. Jesus had said it himself. Judas had a seat. He had been promised a throne. He just needed Jesus to take his. The breaking point did not announce itself. It came quietly in stages, wearing the face of ordinary events. 6 days before the Passover, in the village of Bethany, a woman named Mary, sister of Lazarus, the man Jesus had called back from 4 days of death, entered the room where Jesus was reclining at table. She was carrying an alabaster jar of pure nard, imported, sealed, worth, by Judas's calculation, approximately 300 denarii. 300 denarii, nearly a full year's wage for a common laborer. He knew this because knowing the value of things was his function. It was what he was for. She broke the jar. She poured the entire contents over the feet of Jesus, not his head, his feet, and wiped them with her hair, and the fragrance filled the entire house. It was an act of extravagant, irreversible devotion. And something in Judas cracked. Why was this ointment not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor? The Gospel of John records these as his exact words, and then John adds something devastating. He said this not because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief, and having charge of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. We do not know when the stealing began. We do not know if it was small amounts at first, a few coins rationalized as unpaid wages, as compensation for the labor of management, as temporary. We do not know if it grew. We only know that by the time of Bethany, John considered it established fact. But Judas's objection was not only financial, the objection was theological. It was strategic. 300 denarii poured onto the floor, or rather, onto the feet of a man who kept talking about a kingdom but refused to act like a king, was not just wasteful. It was a signal that Jesus was moving towards something other than what Judas had imagined. Something smaller, something interior, something that smelled of burial ointment, because that is what Jesus said in response. Leave her alone. She has kept it for the day of my burial. Burial. The word landed in the room and no one moved. The disciples looked at each other across the table. Judas looked at Jesus, and Jesus looked back, not at the jar, not at Mary, but out towards something none of them could see. Judas understood in that moment what the others may not have allowed themselves to understand. Jesus was not going to fight. He was not going to raise an army. He was not going to call down the 12 legions of angels that he himself would later reference in Gethsemane. He was walking deliberately toward his own death, and he was asking his followers to walk with him. That was not the agreement. That was not the throne. That was not what 3 years of evidence had promised. The meal in Bethany ended. Judas left the house and walked in the night air of Judea, and something inside him that had been bending for months finally made its decision. He went to the chief priests. The political machinery of Jerusalem was already in motion against Jesus. The Sanhedrin, the supreme Jewish council of 71, had convened after the raising of Lazarus and determined formally that Jesus must be eliminated before the Passover crowds arrived and turned what was already a volatile occupation into an open uprising. The high priest Caiaphas had said it plainly: it is better for one man to die for the people than for the whole nation to perish. They needed information. They needed timing. They needed someone who knew Jesus's private movements, where he slept, which roads he walked after dark, which garden he favored for night prayer. Public arrest was impossible. The crowds were too large and too volatile. A night operation required an insider. Judas knocked on the right door. The Gospels record the exchange with compression, as though even the evangelists could not fully bear to dwell in it. What was agreed? 30 pieces of silver. The payment was not random. In the law of Moses, recorded in Exodus 21:32, 30 shekels of silver was the established compensation owed to a master whose slave had been gored to death by an ox. It was the lowest assigned value for a human life in the legal code. Whether the chief priests chose the amount deliberately, as an insult coded into currency, or whether it was standard payment for an informant, the number carried its meaning like a brand. 30 pieces of silver for the man who had called him friend. Judas took the money. He returned to the group. He sat at the table for the Passover meal. He broke bread. He drank from the cup. And then Jesus, who knew, who had always known, looked directly across the table at him and said, "What you are going to do quickly. No accusation, no condemnation, no final appeal. Just permission," or something that sounded like it, delivered in a voice that the other disciples did not understand. They assumed Jesus was sending Judas on an errand. Buy something for the feast. Give something to the poor. The usual work of the treasurer. Judas stood. He pulled his cloak. He walked out of the upper room and into the night. And John, who was there, recorded what followed with 4 of the most devastating words in Scripture. And it was night. He did not run. That is the detail that stays. He walked through the streets of Jerusalem, still lit by Passover lamps, past families reclining at their own tables, past the smoke of temple offerings, past doorposts still marked with the memory of the angel that passed over Egypt, past everything that his people had been delivered from, and towards something he was still telling himself was necessary. His hands were cold, not from the air. The spring nights in Jerusalem could be cold, but this was different. This was the cold of a decision already made that the body had not yet caught up with. I am doing what he would not do himself. I am forcing his hand. When they arrest him, he will have no choice. He will call the angels. He will reveal the kingdom. He will be who he always was. The mind bargains, even when it knows, especially when it knows. He crossed the Kidron Valley. The torchlight of the Temple Mount reflected off the water below. Somewhere above him, on the slope of the Mount of Olives, in a garden called Gethsemane, the name means oil press in Aramaic, the place where olives are crushed, Jesus was praying. Judas fixed his eyes on a stone at the side of the road. An ordinary stone, grey-white in the moonlight, half buried in the earth. He stared at it for a long moment without moving. The stone did not change. The night did not speak. There was no voice, no fire, no wind. That was the moment something inside him that had always believed finally stopped. He kept walking. The guards were waiting. He had told them the sign, "Whoever I kiss, that is the man. Take him carefully. He is not dangerous. He will not resist." He knew Jesus would not resist. That knowledge, which he had offered as reassurance to the guards, was the confession he could not yet hear himself making. The arrest was swift. The garden became a tangle of torchlight and drawn swords. Peter cut off a man's ear. Jesus touched it and healed it. Even then, even there. Judas stood at the edge of the torchlight and watched. He had expected resolution. He had expected the moment to crack open into something else. Angels, thunder, the kingdom arriving at last. Instead, he watched Jesus put a man's ear back on his head and submit calmly to the rope. The disciples scattered. Judas did not scatter. He was already outside the circle. He did not sleep that night. He could not have said afterward exactly where he went or what he did in the hours between Gethsemane and the trial. There are no witnesses to those hours. The Gospels do not follow him. He is simply elsewhere, alone, in the dark of a city that was already moving toward the execution of a man it had celebrated 5 days earlier with palm branches and hosannas. By morning, he knew what was going to happen. Word traveled fast in Jerusalem. The Sanhedrin had condemned Jesus on the charge of blasphemy. The case had been handed to Pilate. The crowd was assembling. The machinery that Judas had set in motion was completing its cycle with a speed and finality that his calculation had not prepared him for. He went back to the chief priests. He was carrying the 30 pieces of silver. "I have sinned. I have betrayed innocent blood." The words came out of him like something that had been pressing against the inside of his chest for hours and finally found a way out. He stood in front of the men who had paid him, who had used him, who had needed him, and now had no further use for him, and he said the truest thing he had ever said. Their response was the cold efficiency of men who had already moved on to the next problem. "What is that to us? See to it yourself." He threw the coins into the temple, 30 pieces of silver scattered across the stone floor. The sound of them ringing against the pavement, that bright metallic sound, far too light for what they weighed. He turned and walked out. He had not eaten. He could not have said when he had last slept. His body was present on the roads of Jerusalem, and his mind was somewhere it could not come back from. He kept seeing the garden. He kept seeing Jesus' face, not angry, not afraid, just present, just fully, unbearably present, even with his hands being bound. There was a man Judas had traveled with in the first year, a disciple named Nathanael from Cana, who had initially doubted whether anything good could come from Nazareth, and then met Jesus and immediately declared him the Son of God. Nathanael had a way of laughing at himself after a wrong assumption, a kind of rueful, open laugh that acknowledged he had been wrong without letting it destroy him. Judas had always quietly envied that quality, the ability to be wrong and remain intact. He did not have that quality. He thought briefly of going north, back to Galilee, back to Keriyyot, back to somewhere that did not know his name and did not know what he had done. The thought had a shape, a road, a direction, an escape, and he held it for a moment the way a drowning man holds a piece of driftwood. But Keriyyot was in Judea, not Galilee. He had nowhere that was truly away. And the distance he would have needed to travel was not geographical. There was a man who had followed the disciples loosely, not one of the 12, but a supporter who occasionally joined the group for meals. He had seen Judas the night before and had said nothing, had offered nothing, had simply looked at him with an expression Judas couldn't read, not condemnation, not absolution. Just the face of someone who was watching and did not know what to do. That face was the loneliest thing Judas had seen in hours of lonely things, because it was the face of someone who wanted to help and had no idea how. And Judas, who had always been the one who knew how, who managed things, who organized things, who solved the practical problems, had nothing left to manage. The field was south of the city, a potter's field, the kind of land that was too clay-heavy for cultivation, used for the burial of foreigners and the destitute. Judas knew it. He had walked past it on the road to Bethlehem. He had never thought about it before. He thought about it now, but the story did not end with Judas. The story was only beginning. Matthew's gospel records that the chief priests, faced with 30 pieces of silver lying on the temple floor, deliberated. The law was clear. Blood money could not be returned to the treasury, so they purchased the potter's field, the very field, as a burial place for foreigners. And the name of that field, which in Aramaic is Haceldama, was recorded by Luke in the Acts of the Apostles as a place the whole city of Jerusalem came to know. Haceldama, the field of blood. The money Judas had thrown away bought the ground where he fell. There is something in that circularity that is not accidental, that belongs to a grammar of events too precise to be random. The prophet Zechariah had written it 5 centuries before. And I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord to the potter. The text in Zechariah 11. 12 to 13 is itself mysterious. It depicts a shepherd being valued and dismissed for 30 shekels, and the early followers of Jesus recognized in it the precise outline of what had happened. Matthew records this recognition explicitly. The prophecy had been there, the shape of it had been there, only the names were missing. Weeks later, in an upper room in Jerusalem, likely the same room where the Last Supper had been shared, 120 followers of Jesus gathered. They were not hiding anymore. Something had changed 11 days earlier in a way that none of them had adequate language for. The resurrection accounts had circulated, the ascension had happened, and now the group was together, figuring out what came next. Peter stood and spoke about Judas. He did not speak with contempt. He spoke with the precision of a man trying to understand what had happened within the framework of what he now believed about Scripture and prophecy. He called Judas one of our number, one of us. He acknowledged that Judas had shared in the ministry, had been allotted his portion, had been part of what they were. And then he said, "We need to fill the empty place." The group prayed. They cast lots, an ancient practice of discernment, trusting the outcome to God. And a man named Matthias, who had been with them from the baptism of John through the ascension, was chosen. 12 again. Not because the number was arbitrary, because the number meant something. 12 tribes, 12 foundations, 12 gates. The structure of the kingdom that Judas had believed in so ferociously was not abandoned because one of its architects had broken. It was completed with someone else. 2 months after that, on the Feast of Pentecost, something happened in Jerusalem that brought 3,000 people into the community in a single day. The movement that Judas had decided was finished, that he had decided needed forcing, needed an ultimatum, needed the pressure of an arrest to reveal its true power, was growing without armies, without political maneuvering, without any of the instruments he had believed were necessary. The day they realized they were going to be all right, it looked like ordinary people gathering in ordinary rooms, breaking ordinary bread, and finding that something they could not explain was present in the breaking. The tragedy of Judas is not that he betrayed Jesus. The tragedy is that he did not believe the resurrection was for him. Every other disciple in that circle had failed. Peter had denied. Thomas had doubted. The others had fled. James and John had jockeyed for power in the very weeks before the crucifixion. The disciples were not a gallery of moral excellence. They were ordinary human beings with specific, documentable failures. And every one of them, after the resurrection, was met not with accounting but with presence. Peace be with you. The first word spoken by the risen Jesus to the assembled disciples was shalom. Not a verdict, not a demand for explanation, not a renegotiation of terms. Judas did not wait for that morning. He judged himself before anyone else did. He took the accounting into his own hands. The one job he was never supposed to do, the one ledger that did not belong to him. He had carried the bag for 3 years, calculating costs and balances, and in the end he tried to balance the account of his own soul and found it irredeemably in deficit. The name Judas, Judah, means praise in Hebrew, the same root as the Hebrew word todah, which means thanksgiving. He carried in his very name the possibility of what he could have been, a man of praise, a man who, having seen what he had seen, poured it out, not like betrayal, but like that perfume in Bethany, that extravagant, irreversible act of laying everything at the feet of someone greater than yourself. He almost understood it. Mary had understood it, and he had called it waste. He threw the silver at the feet of the priests and walked toward the field, and we are left, we who are not immune to his logic, we who have also calculated what faith costs against what faith delivers, we who have also had a version of Jesus that we needed to be true. We are left holding the question he never stayed to hear answered. What if the kingdom was never the one you imagined? What if the throne you were promised was not made of power, but of something that only looks like loss from the outside? The field that bore his name was purchased with his money and became a place of burial for strangers, foreigners, people with no claim to the land. And in one of those reversals that run quietly through all of Scripture, the field of shame became a field of mercy. There is a small church today in Jerusalem, built above what tradition holds to be the site of Haceldama. Pilgrims walk there. They stand in the silence of the Hinnom Valley. They look up at the limestone cliffs and the terraced olive groves and the walls of the old city rising in the distance, and they are quiet because the place demands it. Judas is not buried there. But something of the story is. Somewhere in the long record of human failure and divine patience, there is a space held open for the man who got it wrong, in a way that still feels, 2,000 years later, uncomfortably familiar. The man who loved a vision more than a person. The man who calculated when he should have surrendered. The man who took the accounting of his soul into his own hands and found the math too brutal to survive. His name meant praise. He died in silence. And the question he could not ask, the one that might have saved him, was only 3 words long. Can I return? If this story moved something in you, tell me in the comments. I read every one.